Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining today's webinar where we're going to learn more about moving from AOBRD to ELD. Before we get started with today's webinar, I want to make sure that everyone has everything they need to be able to view the webinar successfully. So let's just take a quick minute, and what you'll see once you've logged into the webinar here, you have the ability to join via audio, so feel free to either run this completely through your computer audio, or you can also dial in if that's easier for you. We're also going to be recording today's webinar, and we'll send it out to everyone so you have a chance to view it after the event or to share it with any of your team members. So with that, what I'd like to do is I'd like to go ahead and have today's presenters introduce themselves to us. So Bill, I'll have you and Denise begin the introductions, please.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm Bill Mahorny. I'm Chief of Enforcement here at the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration within the Office of Enforcement. And I also am very happy to have with me Denise Wagner, who is my expert on ELD. She is what we call our ELD program manager and coordinates most, if not all, of our field activities, training, et cetera, et cetera. So we're very, very happy to be here today. And just to give you a little background on what we do here in our division, in the enforcement division, what we do is anytime there's regulatory or legislative changes that are enacted, it's our job to develop field policy, enforcement policy, and train the field and the states to make sure that everything is done the same way in Maine as it is in California.
Wonderful. Thanks, Bill and Denise. We're glad you could join us today. We're happy to have you here. And I'd also like to have Oswaldo Flores from Teletrack Navman introduce himself.
Hello, everybody. Pleasure to be on. I am Oswaldo Flores, as she mentioned. I am the product manager for our regulatory compliance and safety solutions here at Teletrack Navman, and I work very closely with folks such as Bill and Denise to help ensure that we are following the regs and keeping all of our customers compliant and up to date with our solutions.
Great, wonderful. All right. Well, since we've got a great range of talent here with our speakers, let's go ahead and get started. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Bill and Denise.
Okay, very good. Like I said, really appreciate you all having us here today. Obviously we're here to talk about ELDs. The first slide that you see here is ELD rule transition. It shows the arrow shows about where we are. Actually, the arrow is probably a little further over towards the December 16th date now. We're getting pretty close. This is, of course, the phased-in compliance time where folks could be grandfathered with their AOBRDs. That, of course, ends 12/16, which is the full implementation date, which is the mandatory use of ELDs. No more AOBRDs for folks that are required to have an ELD. This is something that is very important for everybody to know. But again, it's coming up here. I mean, it's hard for Denise and I are looking at each other here. It seemed 4 years ago when the rule was done that this was a million years away, but it's here. I mean, December 16th is the full implementation date. So that is where we are at the moment. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, the transition must be complete by December 2019. And one of the things that we're trying to really work with the vendors on, such as your vendor, is making sure that the ELD mode, if you have an ELD operating in AOBRD mode, that you do get that software transition as quickly as possible, just to avoid any last-second problems. Because frankly, there's not going to be any delays. There's not going to be any stops. There's not going to be any light enforcement. I mean, 12/16 is the date. It's part of the statutory deadlines for the rulemaking activities, and we're just trying to do everything we can to help the vendors and help the carriers make sure that everybody is transitioned in time to avoid any last-minute crunch, because you know how it is when you're dealing with anything IT. If there is a big crunch or something, if something goes wrong, frankly, on December 17th, if you don't have an ELD, you're out of service. And that is the last thing we want to happen. So anyway, we've still got time here, but you're probably going to hear this theme a lot from me today, is work with your vendor. If they've got a time schedule set up that you can accommodate, please work with them on it. The other part of this is, take advantage of any training or anything that your vendors are providing for data transfer, editing processes, how to use all the different functionality of the ELD as soon as you possibly can, or continue to do it. I mean, you folks are already established people, but it never hurts to keep training. We certainly do it with all of our field staff. We've been in full train mode for about 3 years now, and we're going to continue doing it all through and probably beyond the deadline. But again, and we can't stress enough, not having an ELD when you need to have one after December 16th is an out-of-service condition. And that, obviously, if you're sitting there with an AOBRD, an ELD operating in AOBRD mode, and you have an opportunity, or you had an opportunity to transition to it and you didn't, that's a shame. And like I said, that is something we really want to make sure does not occur. Also, just something else that, thinking about some anecdotal things that I've heard from some of the carriers over the last couple of weeks and the last couple of months. A lot of folks are saying, well, the states haven't adopted and this and that. I want to make sure that everybody understands there's only one state that has not fully adopted the ELD rule, and that is Alaska. So if you're not operating in Alaska, you're going to be out of luck on that respect. But it's also important to note, even if the states had not adopted this, that's only for intrastate. If it's an interstate movement, they are bound to do that by their motor carrier safety assistance laws. So anyway, that's just something we've been hearing a little bit about here lately, and I just want to make sure everybody's really clear on that. And even Alaska is working like heck, because that was just, from what I understand from our folks in the State Programs Division, they made a mistake, and they're working to fix that mistake in their current legislative session. But anyway, so if you hear those rumors out there on the CB or whatever, don't believe them. The states have got this adopted for inter and intrastate. As you know, the states have pretty much adopted our regs for intrastate. But interstate, intrastate, you need an ELD. They're going to enforce it. In fact, they're enforcing it now. Next slide, please. Some of the statistics. These are some of the things that we kind of keep track of, because these are things that have been expressed as a concern. As you can see by this graphic, the percentage of driver inspections with at least 1 hour of service violation has dropped a whole lot. It's dropped by about half since the ELD rule came into effect back in December of 17. We're really happy to see that, but actually we're not that surprised, because now, as you know, where people could, quote, fudge before, now they can't. And it is something that the drivers are more aware of, companies are more aware of, law enforcement's more aware of, and as a result, those violation numbers have dropped, and they've stayed pretty steady at about 50% under. So we think that's really, really good news, and that's, of course, why this rule was done. This is why Congress told us to do it. They thought that there was too much falsification, there were too many hours of service violations, and so we always show that graphic, because it is doing what it is supposed to do. And just another thing, since the outer criteria went into effect back in April of 18, less than 1% of all driver inspections have resulted in the driver being cited for operating without a required ELD or a grandfathered AOBRD. So we're really happy about that, too. That means people either have an ELD already, or they've got an ELD that's operating as an AOBRD, or they've got a fully grandfathered AOBRD. So the good news for us on that is the word is out. People are compliant. Like I said, our last concern is the folks who've got the ELDs operating as AOBRDs, making sure that they get transitioned into that ELD mode prior to December 16th. Next slide, please. One of the other things that we'd heard that we now consider a myth that we have the data for, there was a lot of concern expressed by the industry and by some of the folks up on the Hill about the impacts on speeding. They thought that people were going to speed a lot more to beat the clock, since they didn't have any flexibility now. As you can see from this graphic, there's been a couple of little teeny spikes, but if you look at the graphic itself, this is not a big spread. This is just a 3.5 point percentage spread. But you can see the speeding violations have pretty much stayed fairly stable. You know, there might be a little teeny, you know, maybe 0.25% or 0.5%, but for the most part, we're not seeing any increase in speeding, which is good because, you know, certainly we don't want any negative effects of extra speeding. But what we're hoping is happening is that people are adjusting to the new reality that ELDs bring. We're hoping that the shippers that cause so many problems sometimes by not being aware of how their inefficiencies affect your efficiencies, you know, we're hoping that everybody's starting to work together. And I will say this, we have had the opportunity to speak to some shipper forums who are recognizing that this is an issue, and frankly, I'm very happy to hear them say, you know what, we can do this. We can make adjustments. It's previously they really just didn't, either they didn't realize it was a problem or they didn't care, but now they know when they ask somebody to do something or make them sit for 10 hours, nobody can do that. You know, there might have been folks before that said, you know what, I'll just cheat on my log. But now nobody can do that, so the playing field is level, and we're really hoping that the shippers and the carriers are going to be able to work together better. Next slide, please. Just to go over some of the basic information for regulatory exemptions for ELDs. Basically, as you all know, the rule is if you had to have a paper log before, you have to have an ELD now. There are some exceptions that continue. Short haul, 100 air mile radius drivers, you didn't have to have a logbook before. You don't have to have an ELD now. You can use them if you want, but you don't have to have them. 150 air mile non-CDL freight drivers. Now, some of the ELD exemptions that we put specifically in the rule are if you don't have to prepare a paper rod for more than 8 days during any 30-day period. That's really a key one. For folks that don't operate that much, and that's by driver. If you've got 4 or 5 drivers and you have maybe 10, 12 trips a month that you would need, you would exceed 100 air miles or more than 12 hours or whatever, you can spread it out. And that's what a lot of people are doing right now. They're just scheduling a little bit differently. Instead of having one guy do them all, maybe they'll have a couple of different people do them. But there's a lot of ways to deal with that 8 and 30. And the way you think about that 8 and 30 is it's just like the 70-hour and 8-day or whatever. You're always in your 30th day. And you project forward, see where you've been in the past, just to make sure that at some point during this next trip that you are not going to need a logbook or now an ELD. But really, 8 and 30 exemption takes a lot of people out. If you don't do a lot of long haul, don't do a lot of long days, have you know, extra drivers, that's probably something you're going to be able to take advantage of. Conducting driveway towaway, which the vehicle being driven is part of the shipment being delivered, or another very important one, manufactured before model year 2000. And just to clarify that, we do have some Q's and A's up on our website that define that. In essence, and I'm being very oversimplifying here, but if your engine is older than 2000 or your vehicle is older than the year 2000, you're not subject to the ELD rule. You're still subject to hours of service. You still have to do your logbooks or whatever, but it's whichever is oldest. If the vehicle is before year 2000 or the engine is before 2000, and you know, needless to say, you can document that, then you are good. And obviously, if you've got an old engine or something like that, not a bad idea to carry your documentation with you in the vehicle.
Hey, Bill.
Next slide, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. Bill, is it okay if I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Can you elaborate just for the audience here on glider kit trucks, given the ELD exceptions, right? I know that's something that's come up in the past where we've had to provide some guidance to, you know, some carriers and so on. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And we do have a specific Q&A on the website. I can't remember what number it is, but it's in there under exemptions, if I recall, on our website. Mm-hmm. But it's just like I said, the bottom line is, let me give you a couple of examples. Say you've got a 2017 truck, and you replace the engine with a 1995 model. Why you do that, I don't know, but it's possible to do so. And if somebody really wants to do it, they could. Would that vehicle be exempt from the ELD? The answer is yes. They would be exempt because the engine is pre-2000. Now, conversely, say you have a 1995 vehicle, you know, the VIN number, everything like that, you put a new engine in it, or a 2017 engine into it, or anything post-2000 in it. Is that exempt? It still is, yes. So either way, and the bottom line is it's either or, whichever is older. Now at the roadside, you're not required to keep documentation for your engine manufacturer, but you do back at your principal place of business. But our instructions to the field staff and to the states is we're not going to put anybody out of service for that. I mean, obviously, if you can confirm that somebody has a post-2000 engine and a post-2000 vehicle and they don't have an ELD, yeah, you're going to get put out of service. But if somebody says, look, I've got a 2001 truck, I've got a 1999 engine because I got in an accident 20 years ago and they ended up putting a rebuilt in me, that kind of thing. If there is no proof that, say you say, okay, it's a 1999 engine, there's no proof otherwise, then you're probably not going to get put out of service if everybody does what we're telling them to do. But what may happen is they may come and take a look at your principal place of business and make sure you've got the proper documentation for that. I'm looking at Donise here, because she helps our training on that. Is that anything to add to that?
Absolutely, that's correct.
Yeah. So the bottom line is, though, is if you have a situation like that, especially if you got a newer than 2000 vehicle and you got an older engine in it, I would say keep your documentation on the truck. It'll save you a lot of grief. But does that clarify?
Sure.
The key is it's either or, whichever is older.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much, Bill.
And like I said, we do have that on our, is a specific Q&A on our website, and let me know, because we can always send you the link to that directly that you can pass on to your folks. Okay, yeah, I mean, these are all very common questions, and these are big enforcement issues too. I mean, these are things that we still get questions on from our enforcement folks. Okay, most common ELD violations. This is what we're seeing so far. Failing to maintain paperwork, not having the instruction manual, not having data transfer instructions. You can imagine how important that can be, and not having blank paper logs. But you do have to have at least 8 days worth of paper logs in case you do have a malfunction. And one thing too is I'll mention as far as malfunction goes, a malfunction doesn't mean that my screen's cracked or something like that. A malfunction is the device cannot track hours. A lot of the little things that may occur, if it's off by the odometer by a mile or two, that's not a malfunction to us that merits the use of paper logs. But if you do have something serious, there is a regulatory provision that says you can go up to 8 days for that. Otherwise, you have to file for an extension, and you certainly have to have good reason to do so. But of course, knowing your vendor, I don't think they'd ever let you get beyond 8 days. They'd fix whatever the problem is. But anyway, that's a very important thing. Make sure you do have the blank paper logs on your vehicle. That is a requirement of the regulation. And of course, the other common ELD violation is the device is unable to transfer the data. Next slide, please. Driver's responsibilities. Know what kind of device you have, especially now. This is where some of the confusion has come in over the past couple of years, is if you've got an ELD operating as an AOBRD, make sure that your driver knows it's an AOBRD, because if the officer thinks it's an ELD and it's operating as an AOBRD, you're going to get cited probably because it's not operating properly as an ELD. So it's extremely important until December 16th. Needless to say, this problem is going to go away on December 16th. But this has been a challenge. We've spent a lot of times making sure that we train the officers to make sure, even if the driver doesn't know, that they can figure it out. But needless to say, it's a lot easier if the driver themselves says, look, this is an ELD, but it's operating in AOBRD mode. So that's really important. Got to have the user's manual. Got to have the data transfer instruction sheet. As we mentioned before, supply of the bank record of duty status or alternative method. The reason we bring that up is some of the folks prior to the ELD rule were using hours of service software, just basically it's just an electronic grid. Is that acceptable after December 16th? Yes, for folks that don't need an ELD. So really, because that's just the same as a paper log, but you still have to be exempt from the ELD rule, but you can have that as a substitute for the 8 days of graph grids, but you have to be able to show the officer, this is what I've got to back this up. I've got this logging software. And also, any supporting documents in the driver's possession must be provided to the safety official upon request. That's the same as it's always been. Supporting docs are something that the officers on the roadside can and need to take a look at. Next slide, please. And like I said, some of these things, if you're already users of the ELDs, you're probably well aware of these, but it never hurts for us to go over them. Within the selected option, ELD must support both methods, telematics, email, and web services, or the local USB and Bluetooth. Our preferred method is, of course, telematics. That is the fastest and most efficient way to do it. That's why we built that into the rule. It certainly is going to save time on the roadside, if nothing else. And of course, as a carrier, ensure the driver is aware of the option, whether it's the local option or the telematics options, and how to do that transfer. Next slide, please. And this is just a graphic of how that works. It's pretty basically simple. We've trained all the officers. Everybody should know how to do it. As long as you've got your instructions in there on how to transfer, it should go pretty seamlessly. We spent a lot of time on that. Next slide, please. One thing, too, since we all know that not all data transfer methods are infallible, so the rule does allow for or requires a display or a printout to be used. That way, if you're ever in a dead area where web services don't work or something like that, we still can check hours of service by using the display screen or the printout from the ELD. Very important because, as you all know, our number one goal is to make sure that you're compliant with hours of service. And this backup is the way that we make sure we do that no matter what.
Hey, Bill. This
yes.
is Ozzy again. Quick question on this scenario here. We've had, and I've heard of this several times, where drivers are at a roadside, and for whatever reason, right, as you mentioned, technology sometimes doesn't always work. And the secondary means of displaying the rods to the officer are via the display. And the driver, whomever, tries to do so, and the safety officer still ends up citing 395.22. What do you suggest, carriers or drivers do in that type of a scenario?
Well, it probably would depend on what the reason was for it not being done. So, something like that's kind of hard to answer because you don't know what the exact scenario. But Denise, I know you've trained on this.
Right. So if there was a malfunction, a documented malfunction within the ELD, the safety official should not be citing the driver for failing to be able to do a data transfer, right? They should go ahead and use the display screen. However, if there's no documented malfunction, the safety official cannot show, or the driver cannot show that there was an actual malfunction, the safety official will go ahead and use the display screen. However, they will cite the driver. They have been trained to cite the driver, and this is correct, for failing to be able to transfer data.
Okay. And by documented malfunction, meaning that the drivers and the carriers need to have some sort of a note stating when the malfunction started, or when it was recorded, effectively, right?
Not that type of malfunction, right? We're talking about a malfunction that would show up within the ELD, maybe like a data diagnostic event, and then there was a malfunction. Right. Those are the malfunctions in Table 4 of Appendix A, which we are referring to. And if those aren't up on the ELD, the driver will be cited.
Okay.
That's why it's
perfect.
That's why it's so important for the ELD to be operating properly, because those data diagnostic things will come up, and that'll be the flag for our officers. But like I said, a lot of those depend on individual circumstance.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and to that point, I think that just drives home the point of why it's important for customers to know the software and understand where to look for those compliance malfunction indicators in the devices as well, so they can point that out to the safety officers as well.
Right, because our officers are trained for that, but that's why what you said is exactly right. The more information that the officer can get at the roadside, the better off everybody is.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay, next slide. End of the working day. Obviously, enter any missing data. Change duty status to off duty and log off. You know, very simple, basic things. And of course, certify that the data entries, that's basically what it is. You're certifying just like you did with a paper log. And of course, just like previously, you have to submit to the motor care within 13 days of it being generated. Can you do it sooner? Absolutely, but 13 days is the requirement. Next slide, please. Edits and annotations. As you know, there's a specific field for annotations, but drivers can make edits that are ELD record, but drive time cannot be shortened. In fact, one thing that cannot be done within an ELD, and that's one of the key things of an ELD, is anything that's generated in that respect by the ELD cannot be changed. So that is really a key. You can't go in and actually edit driving time, like I said, to make it shorter or anything else. But if there is, say, somebody messes up while they are, off duty versus, on duty not driving or something like that, forgets to change their status, the annotation of that is what's very important. The annotation is the opportunity for the driver to explain what happened, and of course, if they're telling the truth, everything's going to be backed up. If they were just sitting somewhere, the GPS is not going to. It's going to show within that. Say they were at a certain place for 2 hours, but they forgot to change their duty status. The officer would be able to look at that. That 1 hour ping had happened. See them in the same spot. They're going to be able. It's all going to match up. In other words, but the key is for the annotations. That's where it's important, especially if someone's on personal conveyance or something like that. Annotate, annotate, annotate. We tell them that's your opportunity to do it right then and there. We always encourage everybody to make the annotation as soon as possible. It's just like with the logbook, and that was something, back in Don East was an investigator here long after I was, but one thing that used to make me crazy is when I'd be out there on the roadside and I'd see somebody frantically scrambling, writing 3 or 4 days worth of logbooks because they didn't keep up with it. Well, guess what's going to happen? You're going to have a false log then. And maybe you didn't have an hours of service violation, but since you were negligent in writing everything down at the time, next thing you know, you're trying to remember something happened 3 days ago, then you've got a problem. So we encourage everybody at the end of that day, annotate it, do it when it happens while it's fresh in your mind, put as much detail as you think is necessary, keep yourself out of trouble. And of course, the original records are maintained when there is for an edit. And of course, as you probably know, the company cannot propose edits that are not approved. Well, they can propose them, but the driver's got to approve them.
Hey, Bill. Ozzy
yes.
Again. Quick question here. How about this scenario where a driver is, say, in a sleeper berth in a truck stop, wherever they may be, and they get asked to move the vehicle, thus, creating motion. And as you know, right, creating motion is going to move the device out of off-duty sleeper into an on-duty state, a driving state. What do you suggest, or what provision can carriers and drivers take to help prevent against that type of condition? Because I know it happens.
Yeah, that's where the annotation is so important. And that would be a perfect example of there would be no evidence to the contrary that driver actually went on duty and went anywhere. But if you're in an off-duty status and the officer just says, move your truck, this and that shouldn't take you off the off-duty status. What will take you off of off-duty status is if they do an inspection. You know, if they say, sorry, you know, I want to do an inspection on your vehicle, then you're on duty. Anything to add to that, Donise?
Right. So, and then this, going back to Bill's point, of course, it's going to be automatically recorded driving time, and this is where the annotation comes in. It's very important, right? So the driver's not going to be able to go back and change that automatically recorded driving time, but the driver the driver will be able to and should definitely make that annotation explaining, I was asked to move at this certain time, et cetera, I moved from point A to point B, and that's key. As Bill stated, and I cannot emphasize this anymore, annotation is very key, especially in this scenario.
Yeah, and like I said, the beauty of the ELD is every time you change duty status, you get a GPS ping. So it's going to be very apparent. You know, if the officer's well-versed in it, they should be, because Donise and everybody has been training them a lot, is they're going to look at that and they're going to see these GPS pings, you know, basically in the same location. But, you know, like Donise said, we stress it, we probably overly stress it, but I don't think we really can, is annotate it. Because if you don't do it right then and there, later on, you might have to try and explain it 13 days later, then you got a problem.
Right, and then, you know, the driver may not get stopped, right? It may be all good to go, the driver tells to annotate, but then the carrier gets an investigation, right? So the carrier is going to be kind of lost, maybe kind of lost on why did this driver move, what happened, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why it's very important that the carrier stress to the drivers that they must annotate any situation like that due to the possible investigation, right? So everything is documented, and there should be no issue.
Yep.
Great. Thanks so much, Bill. Thanks, Donnie.
Okay. Next slide. And our favorite thing, personal conveyance. We always continue to bring this up because it is a very important thing. You know, personal conveyance is the movement of a commercial motor vehicle for personal use while off duty. A driver may record time operating a CMV for personal conveyance as off duty only when the driver is relieved from work and all responsibility for performing work by the motor carrier. And frankly, sometimes folks take that a little bit too liberally, but the bottom line is too, is as a carrier, you don't have to allow that either with your vehicles. We just have, you know, guidance as far as personal conveyance goes. We have definition for what's on duty. We have definition for what's off duty. But next slide, please. We do have some specific examples of what's personal conveyance and what's not personal conveyance. You know, and I won't go through all of these, but, you know, I'm sure that the folks there will give you copies of this presentation as examples. I also encourage people to read the Federal Register notice that we put out about a year ago on this as well. But, you know, basically, if the company allows it, you know, if you are truly off duty, say at a truck stop for 8 or 10 hours or whatever, go to the truck stop, stop there, wake up 3 or 4 hours later, say, you know what, I'm going to go get something to eat. Perfectly acceptable, personal conveyance. What we don't want, though, is continuation of a movement that puts you in a better position for your next load, those kind of things. You know, basically what we teach is, you know, if it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. You know, if somebody says, well, I was in Denver and I decided I wanted to have dinner, but there's a steakhouse in Reno that I really like, that's not going to fly. You know, that's an extreme example, but those are the kind of things that we're trying to avoid. But the bottom line is, if it's a legitimate off-duty period, then you are allowed to use personal conveyance if the carrier allows it. I'm trying to think. There was trying to think of another example here. If a well, can't think of another one off the top of my head. I had a real good one there, popped out of my head. But you know, the bottom line is, oh, I know what I was going to say. I'm sorry. Just because you are in off-duty status doesn't mean you're not in commerce either. You know, there's been a lot of questions that have come up about, well, I was on personal conveyance going to this restaurant and I got pulled over by a law enforcement officer who said, I want to do an inspection on you. Can they do it? Yes, they can. you're in an off-duty status, you're still in commerce, and unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, that once that inspection begins, you are unfortunately no longer in personal conveyance or off-duty. You are on duty, not driving during that period of time. So I'm glad I remembered that. That's something that's been coming up more and more. And you're still subject to everything else, even when you're on personal conveyance, just like off-duty status. You still have to have a license. Your vehicle's still got to be safe. 393, 396, you're just in an off-duty status. Anything to add, Donnie?
Hey, Bill?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Hey, question around this subject here. If they're in commerce, right, so they're personal conveyance, they're operating that vehicle as a, equipment to get from point A to point B, and they're pulled over for an inspection, does the inspection type preclude that they go on duty? Meaning, if it's a CVSA inspection type 1, a level 1 inspection, a level 2, does that act as a qualifier?
Any of those would be on. Yeah, any of those would be on. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
And another point to make, right, if the motor carrier authorizes the driver to use the personal conveyance configuration on the ELD, right, the driver has to select that status prior to any movement and deselect when the movement is complete. Let's say he's going to go to a restaurant. Before he starts driving, select the personal conveyance status, and then when I'm going to a restaurant and he's back at the hotel or whatever, he or she deselect that status. Because if the driver does not do that, this is what's going to happen, right? That driving time is going to be automatically recorded driving time. And as we all know, the driver is not going to be able to change that. So what is he or she going to have to do? Make that annotation, explain, etc., which is okay. But to avoid that heartache, go ahead and make sure you select prior to the movement and deselect when the movement is over. Very key.
Yeah, excellent point, Donise. And also, too, in the PC mode, it's a kind of a fuzzier thing, for driver's privacy. It's within, 10 miles? Yeah, that kind of thing. But, yeah, really good point.
Great. Thank you so much.
Next slide, please. Mm-hmm. And, the bottom line of this slide is that no matter what, whether you're PC, off-duty, whatever, the company and the driver are still responsible for making sure that the driver is properly rested. Because as you know, just because you're legal doesn't mean that you can't be exhausted and be in no condition to drive. So that is something that we strongly encourage the carriers and the drivers to work together on. Drivers to be honest with the carriers, to say, look, I'm too tired to drive. And, of course, hopefully the carrier, being responsive to that and would make adjustments accordingly. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is something Donise just covered about that the ELDs have to have an authorized personal use feature. And like Donise mentioned, save yourself a lot of trouble by annotating or by doing it so you don't have to annotate. The motor carrier is not required to configure the ELD to use personal conveyance feature to permit the use. But like I said, we have rules. We don't enforce your company policies. What we enforce is whether it's off-duty, on-duty, et cetera, but you don't have to configure it that way, but the ELD does have to have this authorized personal use feature. And as I mentioned before, the reporting accuracy is like within a 10-mile fuzzy area. Next slide. And realizing that there's, a lot of folks on this call, that we're probably not going to get a chance to answer everybody's questions. So we got a lot of resources up on our website. We have an email site. We have a website with a lot of Q's and A's. We are in pretty good shape. We've got a lot of people that man these ELD question booths, and we sure get a lot of them. But what's the couple days turnaround now, hopefully?
3 to 5 business days.
3 to 5 business days for something. And, of course, needless to say, you can always call us, too. And if you get us, we'll answer it right away. But that is the good way to do it is first check the website, because I bet you we have a Q&A that covers the situation that you are describing, because we've got dozens of them up there now. But also we do have the email address, and we will give you a response in writing or point you to the appropriate Q&A. And obviously our transition plan for between now and December 16th is getting everybody transitioned. You know, our biggest fear is that folks have the means and the opportunity to get switched over to an ELD mode from AOBRD mode, and they don't do it. To me, that's a huge opportunity lost. There's going to be a lot of people unhappy getting put out of service, and that we do not want. The part of that is continued outreach to industry, and we're going to continue to help train our law enforcement partners and our own folks just to make sure that everybody is ready to roll come December 16th. And that is all we had as far as official presentation. So, you know, I think that folks have been able to send in questions to the folks there running the webinar. So we'll answer whatever you got, or try to anyway.
Well, thank you, Bill and Denise. We appreciate that. That's been excellent information, and thanks for sharing that. Also, thanks to Oz Flores here. So what I'd like to do is go ahead and give people a chance to type in their questions. So while you're doing that, if we have on the call any customers from Teletrac Navman, what we thought we wanted to do, just for a brief minute here, was to just kind of take folks through one extra slide that's going to focus on something that may be near and dear to their heart here while we're typing in questions. All right, so my name is Tracy Kretsch, and I'm a product marketing manager here at Teletrac Navman. I also work on a team that is working with all of our customers to move folks from the A-board to the ELD device. So what I really wanted to do, again, while you folks are typing in your questions here, is just kind of recap what is Teletrac Navman doing to help you do during this move. We really want to make sure that we get all of our A-board customer base upgraded, migrated over to the ELD by the December 2019 timeframe. This is something we've actually had in process for quite some time. So some of you on this call may have actually gone through the upgrade process. You may actually be in process right now. We've been doing it again since last August. It does include a couple of different steps. We've got some folks that really like using the A-board device. We understand that. We hear you. But we really do try and make the move as smooth as possible for everyone. As Bill mentioned earlier, there is some really significant training that's going to make this upgrade really smooth for you and a lot easier for you and all of your team members. So we really do encourage you, when you're looking at kind of moving from A-board on Fleet Director to A-board on Director, that you take that training, and then as you move from A-board on Director to ELD on Director, that you also take that secondary training. Again, this is going to make it a lot easier for you. It'll really make the displays much more clear and understandable, and just ensure that your upgrade and moving to the Director platform is as easy as possible. Now, if there's any customers out there that haven't currently gone through this process, we do have you in a queue, but obviously you may not see that queue from your side. Feel free to go ahead and reach out to either your current customer success specialist and let them know when you would like to perform that move, or go ahead and reach out to customer.communications@teletracnavman.com, and we will work with you and get that scheduled out and make sure that you have access to everything you need to perform that upgrade here. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at some of the questions that may have come in during the time frame here. So let's take our first question. So Bill and Denise, this may fall on your side of the fence. If a carrier is responsible for training and monitoring its drivers to make sure that the drivers are HOS compliant, what happens if a carrier fails to train or monitor its drivers?
Well, I mean, that'll end up being an issue at the roadside and during a compliance investigation, frankly. You know, we do make sure that we make it clear that there's a shared responsibility on both parties' sides. So really, it would be an enforcement. It would end up being an enforcement issue. And it would be, and we'd see it by the fact that there would be mistakes, there would be errors, there would be people not doing the right thing. And if they weren't properly trained in hours of service, they're probably going to get put out of service a lot, because if they don't know what the rules are, it's going to be pretty apparent pretty quick.
All right, great. And another question, does personal conveyance have to remain in the 100-mile radius if operating in a short-haul scenario?
Oh, not sure I understand that. I mean, if you're within a 100-mile radius, the criteria for that is you have to report to work and be released from work within 12 hours. If the question is, does that extend your day in any way? The answer is no. But I'm not sure I'm answering the question on that. Repeat it for me again.
All right, let me slide back up here again. So the way that it was typed in reads, does personal conveyance have to remain in the 100-mile radius if you're operating in a short haul scenario?
So do they, well, yeah, I mean, they're two separate issues. It's really two separate issues. You got personal conveyance, which is an off-duty status, versus a 100 air mile radius, which is a ELD. So, I think I see what you're saying. So if somebody normally operates within the 100 air mile radius, within the 12-hour time frame, but if they are on personal conveyance and they go 103rd mile out there to go to lunch or something like that, wouldn't matter.
Okay.
Wouldn't matter.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, and also just
and I have
so it was clear, personal conveyance, even when operating with an ELD or a AOBRD at this point in time, there's no time limit or distance limit for personal conveyance. It's what you are doing. If you meet the definition of personal conveyance, you're on personal conveyance.
Okay, great. So I have one listener that's asking, so they want to confirm, as of December 16th, 2019, a few months down the road here, do all over-the-road drivers need an ELD device, or will they be shut down?
If you are required to have an ELD during that particular trip and you don't have one, you will be put out of service.
Okay, great. And I have one attendee here who is asking for you to explain the 8-day and 30-day period.
Okay. Yeah, that one, consider every day to be your 30th day. Say you have got, I'm trying to make it real simple here, I'll try to anyway. Say you've got one driver, and that driver last week did a over-the-road trip 7 times in the last 8 days. Went beyond 100 air mile radius, operated for 14 hours, whatever. So today is your 9th day. You know you've got a trip that has to go beyond the 100 air mile radius tomorrow. Okay, you count back 30 days. There were 7 days within the past 8 or 9 days where you had a need for a logbook. You know that this trip coming up is going to be another 2 or 3 days at least. Looking back, there is no way that you're going to be able to do that with one driver. That driver's going to have an ELD, because you know that by tomorrow, if he goes out tomorrow and you count back 30 days, the 1 day tomorrow, counting plus the 7 days last week, that's all within a 30-day period. So once they get beyond that 8th day, once it gets to the 9th day, they'd have to have an ELD. Now, say that driver a month ago had 1 day where they had to operate and would be beyond 100 air mile radius and all that type of thing. Say that was 29 days ago. Hasn't operated beyond 100 air mile radius since then. Now you know that this trip is coming up, and you know it's going to be a 5-day trip that will require a logbook. It will be subject to the hours of service. It'll be beyond the 100 air mile radius. You look back, you know that tomorrow, if that other one was 29 days ago, in 2 days, that one's going to kind of drop off the map. It's no longer going to count. It's just like when you're doing your 70-hour in 8 days. That day will drop off as you move forward. Now, since at worst, he had 1 day, 30 or 29 days ago, but even if they have to go 4 or 5 more days, even if you get to that 5th day, if you count back from that 5th day, you're still not going to have 8 days where that driver needed a logbook and therefore wouldn't need an ELD. I hope that made it clear. But the bottom line is, consider any day that you're operating, and when you count backwards, if you're in the 9th day of having to have a logbook, then you'd need an ELD on that particular day.
All right.
Hopefully
Thank
that's
you for that.
It's kind of a weird concept, but really when you think about it, it's really, you know, the main thing is project forward. If you know a trip's going to be 4 or 5 days, project out 5 days, and from that 5th day, count back 30. And every day you have to count back 30. So tomorrow think, okay, if this driver's got to operate beyond 100 mile radius, if I think back 30 days, is at the 9th day. The 2nd day of the trip, same thing. Always count back 30 days. It's not by the month, it's by 30-day period.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. All right, Bill. So now I have an international question for you here. So if your load, if your load starts in Mexico, when does the 100-mile radius start?
For well, it's when in Rome. But if you're coming from Mexico into the U.S., it starts at the point of origin. If it's going back the other way, it ends at the border. And that's in Canada and Mexico both.
Perfect. Okay, great. Well, that definitely answers kind of our geographic boundary questions here, given where we are. Wonderful. All right. So I think we have time for one last question here. Let's see. I have a driver that lives over 200 miles from the plant. I allow him to bobtail home in the tractor. Can he do that as personal conveyance?
Possibly, yes. If they have to report, that would be commuting. That would be considered commuting time. What he couldn't do is start from home and go to a third place to like pick up a trailer or something like that. But if they actually have to come to a terminal to begin work, then yes, that could be personal conveyance.
Okay. Perfect. Great. Well, I would like to again thank you, Bill and Denise. Lots of great information, lots of great scenarios. Thank you, Oswaldo Flores, for participating as well. Again, for everyone on the call, we will go ahead and send the recorded webinar out to everyone shortly after. We just need a little bit of time for it to compile. So thanks, everybody. We appreciate your taking the time to spend with us and learn more about this important transition from AOBRD to ELD. And again, you'll have the resources from FMCSA as they shared earlier. And we'll also share out the information, so if there's any Teletrac Navman customers on this webinar and you'd like to connect with us to get scheduled and get that ELD done sooner rather than later, which we would all highly encourage, you'll see that shortly. Thank you, everybody. We look forward to connecting with you soon in the future. Have a great rest of your day.